Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today I want to talk about trade and interactions. So as we have gotten settlements and we start to need things, we're specializing, we may have resources in one area, but as we know, resources are not distributed equally. We might want to get something and in return give something that we have a surplus of, right? And so trade is born among all these settlements. And there are some big, of course, initial trade routes that you are already familiar with because you've learned about them, hopefully in history. But I want to just kind of hit on some of the big ones, in particular the Silk roads, the sand trade, and the spice roads, right? So when we talk about the Silk roads, we are talking about this exchange across Eurasia, and it really started from this interaction between the outer regions and the inner regions. And so you have this exchange of goods between pastoral and settled peoples, right? So cities and then wanderers who are following their herds. And then as we start to get these commodities, right, these goods that are traded, silks and spices travel west from Southeast Asia, China, and India, and are traded for glassware, jewelry, perfumes, textiles, pottery, iron, right? And iron is a big thing here. Olive oil, which turns out to be a huge staple across the world. Oil is a big deal, and we've talked about crude oil, but it turns out that vegetable oils and fruit oils are really important. Wine, of course, and then gold and silver. And so when you look at the Silk Roads, they're called the Silk Roads, but we know from history class you have lots of things that are being exchanged. And I put this map in here because I want you to see the initial routes are going to be over land, right? And when you look at them, you can clearly see the impact of geography on travel. If something is hard to go through or impassable, then, obviously if it's impassable, that's not going to work out. But if something is hard, then it has to be really valuable. And I'm going to talk about this when I talk about interactions and what dictates the nature of those interactions. But you can see, look here, you have these huge mountains, right? There are only a couple of places that you can safely get across. And safety is relative in that. The plateau here of Tibet, this is the Himalayas. This is not working out, right? So you have to, of course, go south. And then you end up getting sea routes involved in the silk trade. And sea routes are interesting because, and this is also, this is a map of the silk and spice routes. I'm going to talk about spice in a second. But sea routes have a really big impact. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that there are way stations along the way. These towns are built on trade, right? People can only go so far in a day, and so you have to be able to stop. So if you have this stopping point, cities will build up there, and cities rise and fall based on the trade that goes through them. So there are lots of cities that were on these routes, silk, spice, sand, that don't exist anymore because the routes moved. And when the routes moved, the cities didn't have anything other than being on the trade route, so they died, okay? All right, so which of the following did not play a role in the end of the Silk Roads? Well, sea routes meant that you didn't have to go through all these way stations and middlemen, and the journeys were easier because you didn't have animals, right? And easier is relative. Sea travel is still questionable. But, right, you minimize the middlemen, right? Collapse of the Mongol Empire. Well, when you have a collapse, you always have chaos. The plague, that's never good. And a lot of these places were really dangerous. Not just the geography, but there were people who wanted to steal your stuff. And so it was really hard, yeah? The domestication of the camel is one of the things that made the Silk Roads work, right? The sand routes and all of those things work. So the answer to this question is the domestication of the camel, because that is a driving factor, not a destroying factor. Okay, so let's talk about the sand roads. This is where you're actually doing exchange within North Africa. There are lots of goods that are coming into the coast on the Mediterranean, and those need to be distributed into the interior. And as we know, Africa is a hugely resource-rich continent. Okay. In the north, they have lots of manufactured goods, again, a lot of these coming across the Mediterranean. They have cloth, they have various foods. They also have salt. And salt is not something that we think about as being really valuable, but there's a great book actually entitled Salt that talks about the history of salt as being one of these really valuable commodities. Pepper, salt, cinnamon, spices in general have always been very expensive up until recently. In the south, you had your growing regions, you've got ivory from elephants, you have gold, right, all kinds of things. This all relies on camels. And then, of course, involved in this, you have the slave trade. So there is slavery going on within Africa between African groups, and then there's also the external slave trade where people are being shipped out, right? So you have these two slave trades that are happening, and they're connected, of course. Okay, and then here is a map of that, kind of where everything is coming from. Okay, and then here just again you can kind of see, this is interesting too because they are going like through the Sahara Desert, and one would think, hey, we can't do that, but it turns out that there are oases within the Sahara that provide for way stations, just like we see going out west in the United States, right? Las Vegas happens to be an oasis essentially, right, in the desert, which is otherwise impassable. A lot of these towns die out when overland trade through the Sahara is no longer necessary so much, right? Okay, so let's talk about the sea routes, and the ability to ship things by sea is huge. Now, for a long time, we couldn't ship things everywhere by sea, right? I mean, you still have to get to the interiors of continents, and that's going to be true. This is one of the reasons that 80% of people live along waterways, right? The best way to ship something is by boat because you don't have to deal with animals. So let's say that you're shipping grain. If you're shipping grain a long distance over land, it's going to be animals that carry it, whether it's camels or horses or mules or oxen or whatever, right? But here's the thing. You have to feed them. So a certain percentage of your grain is going to go directly to feeding those animals, and you lose that profit, right? That's a real problem. Boats don't eat. So sea transport is cheaper in the long run because you get to keep the majority of your product, and you don't have to have necessarily as many people to do it. You certainly don't have to have the animals, right, which we already talked about. Anyway, so sea routes, really big deal. The first big sea route in terms of trading are going to be these that I showed you in the map originally, that are along the silk and spice trades, right? So what are some of the trade goods we're talking about? And again, you guys have talked about this probably in great detail in your history classes. This is just an overview to remind you of these big things because it's important to our conversation about globalism, because we still see these connections today. They're just more sophisticated with giant ships and airplanes and information. But it's all still the same. We're trying to get goods and ideas from one place to another. And these, of course, are the founding routes for society. Okay, so civilization. So what are some trade goods that you might be able to recall quickly for an example for, I don't know, like a free response or something? Teak came from India. Mangrove was coming from East Africa. Horses were going from the Middle East to India. Spices from all over Asia, right, and Oceania, Indonesia, that area. Frankincense is coming from Africa and the Middle East, and of course slaves are coming from Africa. All right, and when you put it all together, this is kind of what you get. All right, so let's talk about some definitions, right? Because one of the things that we see once we start getting trade routes is that more established countries decide that they want to have those resources in other places. And what we're talking about are colonies, okay? So we want to talk a little bit about colonialization. Again, you know lots about colonialization. I just want to review in terms of what we need for this course, and then again, you know lots and lots about this. So Here's your next question. Which of the following correctly describes the type of international interactions? So we're looking at colonies and we're looking at protectorates. Which one of them is a country or territory with its own internal government, but it's under the control of an outside power? And which one is a country or territory governed internally by a foreign power? Okay, the correct definition for colony is a country or territory governed internally by a foreign power. It is just an extension of that country. A protectorate, on the other hand, is a country or territory that has its own internal government. It's just being controlled by an outside power. So those are two different definitions, and you want to be familiar with those because there are definitely different impacts. If you have your own internal government, then you can keep a lot of the things that are integral to your country, right? If you are a colony, you tend to lose all of that. Now, what are the reasons for colonization? You know this, I've put it in here, but I do want you to be able to divide them into economic, political, and social regions, okay, or reasons. Economic is going to be all about that trade and getting those raw materials, getting jobs, right? Political, you are trying to gain territory, you're going to gain goods, right? That's economic and political. You're trying to empire build, right? And you want to have control over the flow of goods. Socially, colonies are a way to spread ideas. They're also a way to move away from religious persecution. Okay, they protect your own culture and they provide opportunities for people who are unhappy within their country now. So, like if you're England, if you're Great Britain, and you have a colony in the United States, British citizens can come to the United States in hope of a better life, right? Because they're unhappy at home, there aren't any opportunities. So they blend together, but kind of have this sense of I want to understand economic, political, and social. Okay, so colonies trade three ways. Within the colony, directly exchanging goods back and forth, and this actually says Europe. I meant to change it with the home country because Europe is not the only colonizing country. Japan, for instance, China, right? So, hang on. Yay, magic. Okay, so back and forth with the home country, and then you have triangular trade, which is where you've got going from the colony back to the home country to new places. And an example of that, using Europe as the home country groups, right, is the transatlantic trade routes. But you saw them going from India and all of these other places too. Okay, so one of the things that happens out of colonialism is the driving of transport, right? See what I did there? You really develop lots of transportation inventions, right? Technology. You also have the development of cities, which I already talked about, but port cities become huge and they become not just transport centers, but administrative centers. And then you have all of these really strong networks and these interactions systems, and they are built to exploit resources, agriculture, and minerals, right? In particular, agriculture and minerals in particular. The colonies are not always well connected to each other physically, but, right, you have to really push, and so you get lots of increases in technology, right? Faster ships, railroads, better roads, things like that. So I just want to say really quickly, the difference between colonialism and imperialism is really important. Colonialism, the driving force there is going to be all about trade, and it's really kind of an economic thing, right? A country claims sovereignty, and that's great, right? Sometimes there's an interesting exchange in the colonies. Take England and India. There was an very interesting exchange of ideas. Now, obviously, it's really heavy-handed on the British side, but right, the British really did push their ideas, their culture, all of that, and they did try and get rid of a lot of the indigenous culture, right, in India when they went in. Having said that, though, there was some exchange, right, that you still see today. Imperialism is all political and social. I mean, obviously there's the economic component, but it's much more politically and socially driven. It's about dominating other cultures, right? It's not just about the resources, it's a mindset more, right? And so here's your next question. Which of the following was an imperial nation as opposed to a colonial nation? Denmark, the Netherlands, France, Spain, they're all colonial nations, right? Japan, on the other hand, was an imperial nation. They were setting up intentionally an empire. Okay, so which of the following is neither an imperial nation nor a colonial nation? Well, that would be the United States, right? The United States started out as a colony and became its own country. Okay, so let's talk about the effects of colonization, because the United States, right, starts out as a colony, and one of the things that's really helpful is that the infrastructure is already set up, right? So I want to give you an example, though, about Africa, because sometimes it goes well when you are released from being a colony, right, in the United States. India, they're doing very well, right? Not all places are successful afterwards. Haiti's an example. They were a French colony. Many of the African countries. The Africans lost all control of their land and their independence, and so it caused a real setback that's very hard to recover from when the colonial power is gone. Also, lots of new diseases, and most people don't want to be colonized, right? If you already have people living there, and this happened in the United States too, the Native Americans didn't want to be colonized, and so you have conflict and people die. The other thing is a lot of times the colonial powers will come in and they will set up farming, agriculture systems to make the products that they want to make, right? Coffee, tea, sugar, chocolate, whatever. And so they switch from the subsistence farming that the indigenous peoples are doing, right, to cash crop farming, and people die because there's not enough food. And of course, there's that suppression of all of the traditional cultures, and so you lose that. Now, having said that, there are some positive effects too. Okay, in Africa in particular, it did reduce local warfare, partly because everybody sort of united and was like, we don't want the British, but there was still some tribal warfare, so colonies can do that, right? There is improved sanitation, because the power coming in is usually more industrialized, and they want to industrialize the place that they are coming to, and so they will improve hospitals, buildings, all kinds of stuff. They'll also improve the infrastructure, railroads, bridges, dams, telegraph, telephone lines, all of those things. And those were all built in colonies around the world. But again, there are still huge problems. But this is an example of, particularly in Africa. Having said that, though, this is going to be everywhere, right? This is going to be everywhere where you have colonies coming in. All right, now, what are some problems with decolonization? When you have a colonial power that has been the dominant factor leaving, who succeeds that colonial power? And the new governments oftentimes don't want to go back to being territorial regions, and so they will stay like, hey, everybody's all together, I'm going to control everybody now. And so you get this instability, because what if you have a lot of different kinds of people? What if you have a lot of different groups of people? Who gets to be in charge if we're not going to divide back into territories? So you have civil wars, rebellions, dictatorships, ethnic tensions, and those tensions often lead to genocide or oppression, so it's not great. And there is oftentimes a huge amount of corruption because, hey, they're leaving, I could pay them a lot of money, and I could be in charge when they leave. So stuff like that. Ooh, if you support me, I'll give you this if I'm in charge, right? That kind of stuff. So there are real problems with decolonization. You have to be very particular about how you do it, okay? So when we look at all of these things, is colonialism responsible for today's least developed nations, right? So development in the least developed countries, almost all of which are in Africa. It's one of the least achieving regions in the world, okay? There's a complex set of causes to this, right? So when we look at it, do they have a lack of resources? No. Do they have a lack of labor? No, there are lots of people who want to work. There are lots of people who need jobs right now. I mean, the unemployment rates are hugely high. There's an abundance of people who can work. Do they have a lack of capital? Well, look at Nigeria. When we talked about Nigeria, they have huge amounts of oil revenue, right? So what is it? It turns out that government corruption, incompetence sometimes, and many times socialist policies have not been able to allow these countries the economic stability and growth to really become industrialized. And so the question becomes, how do you get these countries over that sort of hump and into being well established? Okay, so shift. I want to talk really quickly about spatial interactions, okay? Because when we talk about trade, we're really talking about the behavior of entities that are coming in contact with each other because one has something the other one wants. So when we talk about spatial interactions, we're talking about the movement of anything within and between areas, right? And so what trade does is it attempts to alleviate the spatially differing available of resources, commodities, information, and opportunities. Those are the big four things. Resources, that's the stuff that you make stuff with. Commodities, that's goods that you trade. Information, and opportunities. So which would not be an example of a spatial interaction commodity flow? Well, obviously, if you have two people meeting and discussing, well, there you go. The Panama Canal was built to facilitate faster trade routes, right? If you're an Amazon Prime member, you are getting goods from an entity that is coming from somewhere else, right? The goods are coming from somewhere else. But if you're a spacewalking astronaut repairing the ISS, you are awesome, but you are not part of a spatial interaction or commodity flow. Okay, so what are the three bases of interaction? And we're going to do this quickly, but you do need to know them. It's complementarity, transferability, and intervening opportunity. Basically, it works like this. Resources, products, and people are not uniformly distributed, and commodity flows are responses to these differences. It's based on the idea of supplies and markets, transportation connections, costs of movement, right? How much does it cost to get things places, and how much people can pay for things, right? What does that cash flow look like, right? So three flow determining factors: complementarity, transferability, and intervening opportunity. Complementarity is just the idea that two places will interact or could interact if one has something the other one wants, right? So think about oil. Crude and refined petroleum move between really separate areas because somebody wants it, right? Now, just having different stuff is not enough to initiate exchange. So think about it this way. Brazil and Greenland have totally different resources, but they have almost no interaction because they don't really want the things the other one has. And it's really, really far. Okay, so you've got to want it, and you have to be able to transfer it. There has to be an acceptable cost of the exchange, right? It can't be too expensive. And it's not just about availability and demand, but it's also about time and cost. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So when we talk about the mobility of a commodity, it's about the characteristics and value of the product. The higher the value, the farther it'll go. The distance, which is measured in time and money, over which it has to be moved. I mean, if you think about it, if the cost is too great to the buyer, they're going to find something else that they're going to buy instead. Okay, and it's the ability of the commodity to actually bear the cost of the movement. And so that can also include time, right? If you want to ship a banana to someplace really, really far, that may not work because by the time it gets there, it could be overripe and no one's going to want to buy it or eat it. And that's a really important thing too. You probably wouldn't want to ship, sugar art someplace in an airplane or that's not packed well, because it'll just collapse, you know. So you have to think about durability of goods, stuff like that. So which of the following is an example of transferability? Thomas Jefferson commissions the search for a Northwest Passage. You camp out overnight for tickets to Vampires vs. Zombies 2. You debate regular ground or overnight shipping or all of the above. You're really tempted to say all of the above, but it's actually debating between regular ground and overnight shipping. This gives you this flexibility. You're talking about time. So you might pay more for overnight shipping, but you will get it faster. You might pay less for regular ground, but it'll take longer to get there. But there you go. You've got this time and money measurement. Okay. Moving on. Transferability is going to differ between places and times, right? It's going to change with what's being transferred and the manner in which that transfer is occurring. And like I said earlier, the object of the value, if it's very high, is going to outweigh the difficulty of acquisition. Okay, and so you can think of lots and lots of examples. So we're just going to move on to intervening opportunity. Complementarity is only effective in the absence of a more attractive source. Okay, so my example is I wouldn't buy sand here for my, garden or backyard from the Sahara because I can just get it from Galveston. It's cheaper, it's closer, it's great. So the cost and convenience, that does not make sense. Hold on. Okay, there we go. It's fixed. So cost and convenience mean that you're unlikely to buy something for somewhere else that's more expensive if you can get it closer and cheaper. That's all there is. Okay, which brings us to the idea of friction and distance decay. Okay, the friction of distance is that idea that it becomes more expensive or more difficult to get stuff from farther away, and so you're less likely to do it, right? And that, as you kind of map that decay of exchange, is called distance decay. Okay, and we've talked a little bit about that before. All right, so which of the following involve friction of distance? In 1773, America is being governed from London. JFK announces the goal of putting a man on the moon, or the Transcontinental Railroad is completed. Well, it's going to be A and C, right? America gets upset, actually, because being governed from London doesn't work because it's so far away. That friction of distance really impacts the ability of Great Britain to govern the United States well. A lot of other things too. This is a really complex thing, but that is part of it, friction of distance. The Transcontinental Railroad, on the other hand, decreases the friction of distance because it allows for more efficient, cheaper, faster transport. A and C is the answer. Okay, so this brings us to the idea of the gravity concept, and it's that idea, and you can actually compare it to Newton's law of universal gravity, but that exchanges will be based on the sizes of the groups divided by the distance. Distance is inversely proportional. So if you think about the law of universal gravitation, right, you had the size of the bodies. The bigger the body, the more attracted they are to each other. But the farther apart they are, the less attraction there is. Okay, so larger cities are going to attract more people. They're going to be able to ship out more goods. And so being farther from a large city is less likely to impact the interaction than being far from a small town. Okay? All right, so which of these best illustrates the gravity concept? London begins as the Roman outpost Londinium. You visit your cousin in Manhattan. Mount Rushmore is a popular tourist attraction, or none of the above. Well, London, beginning as the Roman outpost, right? It's got lots of goods because it's connected to Rome, and so people start coming there for more opportunities. It grows, more people come from farther away. It grows, more people come from farther away, and then all of a sudden you have this, not all of a sudden, but you have this big city, right? So, London, beginning as the Roman outpost Londinium. Okay, so the potential model is going to add in to that gravity model this idea of a web of multiple places that has markets and land values and the ability to communicate and transportation networks, right? Because distance decay and the gravity model really only deal with two places, but we know in reality that it's lots of places, right, form a network. So what we do is we take that gravity model and distance decay and put it all together with multiple places to give a view of the relative position of each point in a network in relation to all of the other points in that network. All right, and that brings us to the idea of movement biases, because distance decay and the gravity and potential models help us understand these bases, that was hard to say, bases for interaction in a perfect world. And now, obviously, there are natural and cultural barriers to movement, to mountains, conflict, things like that. And these models don't take those into account. This is ideal, okay? But basically, think about a shopping center attracts people, right? The merchants see the flow of people and open new shops. Now, even more people go there to shop, right? This is creating a movement bias. Yeah. So once flow patterns develop, they tend to cement themselves and create this kind of anchored pattern, and it's hard for people to kind of shift from the patterns they already have. Now, direction bias also implies that the movement is not random, and direction bias may have a geographical impact. It may be caused by other things, but once you get a direction bias, it's kind of hard to undo that. And Dallas has a really good example. If you think about Dallas, we have a north-south direction bias, right? We have lots of big arteries that go north and south. We've got the tollway, we've got 35, and we've got 75, okay? For crosstown going east and west, it's the only big highway to do that is 635. Then you go way further north and you get Bush, and then you've got further north in 121, and then further south and you've got 30. But there's not a lot in between. There's nothing actually in between 30 and 635 and 121, and they are way further apart than 35, the tollway, and 75, right? And so we have this direction bias. Now, when you set up all of these routes and biases, you get a network bias, and that's caused by the presence or absence of connecting channels, and the presence or absence is caused by all kinds of things. And it's a little bit more complicated. We'll reference that as we go through, but I'm not going to go through that today. Okay, so here's your next question. As a result of network bias, and these notes are a little bit longer, but I'm almost done. As a result of network bias, you're more likely to drive a car than take a train. A shop owner pays higher rent for a location on I-75. You prefer writing letters to sending email. You watch one TV station more than another. Well, a shop owner is going to pay higher rent for a location on Central, right? Because there's more flow, more people will see them, more people are more likely to stop there, and then they can be part of that movement bias, yeah? And then part of that network. All right. Last thing, we've already talked about individual activity spaces when we talked about temporary migration, but I want to just quickly call your attention to something called the tyranny of time. Individual activity spaces depend on three variables. Where you are in your life, how mobile you are you walking, do you have a car, are you taking public transportation, what demands and opportunities are available or placed on you in your daily life, and and then to the time that you have, okay? And that's kind of that fourth piece. So when you put all of that together, these time, temporal, and spatial constraints, that's called the space-time prism, and that is going to be limited by the critical distance. And think about it this way: you could not drive to Colorado to pick up a cup of coffee and come back and still be within the same day, number one, but your day would not progress, right? You couldn't get everything done. You're not going to drive to Colorado before school to get a cup of coffee and come back in time for school. So critical distances. This is the distance beyond which cost, effort, and means will strongly influence our willingness to travel. Now, I used a really kind of extreme example, but you can think about it this way. And you're thinking about goods and stuff like that. Every good actually does have a critical distance. You might be willing to travel really far for a domestic fox, right? You can't get those everywhere. If you wanted to have a domesticated fox, you might be willing to travel all the way to Russia to get it, right? You're not going to travel all the way to Russia to get a cup of coffee, right? You're probably going to want to stay in your neighborhood, on your way to school, things like that. Now, the critical distance is also the distance that you can travel and still get everything done. So your space-time prism has sort of a critical boundary around it, okay? So we'll be dealing with all these concepts going forward. If you have any questions, please ask me in class, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening for 5 extra minutes. All right.